The UFC's plan to stage a fight on the South Lawn of the White House was supposed to produce the most significant card in MMA history, and instead what the sport got was a last-minute scramble, three completely contradicting stories, and a public war of words between the #1 and #2 pound-for-pound fighters on the planet. Ilia Topuria says he went to sleep one night fully expecting to fight Islam Makhachev at the White House and woke up to a completely different opponent, and every single version of the story that has been told since then directly contradicts at least one other version in ways that make the full truth impossible to extract cleanly. On the evening of March 7, 2026, something went wrong inside the UFC's matchmaking operation during UFC 326 Fight Week in Las Vegas, while Dana White and his team were in the middle of finalizing what was supposed to be the most anticipated card in the promotion's history. The card the world saw announced was not the card the UFC had originally built, and the gap between those two versions of the card is where every explosive detail of this story lives.
President Donald Trump announced the White House fight concept on July 3, 2025, during a rally at the Iowa State Fairgrounds, floating the idea of hosting a full-scale UFC championship event on the grounds of the White House itself for the first time in American history. The event was designed as the centerpiece of the America 250 celebrations, marking the semi-quincentennial of the United States. The date was locked in on October 6, 2025, during a speech at Naval Station Norfolk, and the event was confirmed for June 14, 2026, coinciding with Trump's 80th birthday and the Flag Day holiday. The logistics were staggering even before the fight card was built, with the UFC expected to cover the full cost, including roughly $700,000 to restore the South Lawn after use, no public tickets made available, and an estimated total budget of $60 million for an event with under 5,000 seats due to security constraints. TKO President Mark Shapiro stated publicly that the event was not expected to turn a profit, with the goal being to recoup approximately half the total cost through sponsors and new partnerships, making clear this was never about traditional revenue, but about prestige, brand positioning, and making a statement loud enough for the entire sporting world to hear. When the UFC sat down to determine which fights belonged on this historic stage, there was one matchup that virtually every person in the MMA universe pointed to simultaneously: Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria, the #1 pound-for-pound fighter against the #2 pound-for-pound fighter. The rivalry between these two men had been building across weight classes and social media exchanges for over a year, and the layered history behind it made the White House the perfect stage to finally force a resolution to a feud that had grown too big for any ordinary card to contain. Makhachev had made 4 successful defenses of the lightweight title before vacating the belt to move to welterweight, where he defeated Jack Della Maddalena at UFC 322 via dominant unanimous decision to claim the 170-pound strap and establish himself as a 2-division champion. Topuria had vacated his featherweight title specifically to chase Makhachev at lightweight, knocked out Charles Oliveira in 2 minutes and 27 seconds in the first round at UFC 317 to become the 10th multi-division champion in UFC history, and by early 2026, the two men were the reigning champions of adjacent divisions, with a personal bitterness running underneath the sporting rivalry that neither one had bothered to disguise publicly.
The rivalry had a specific origin point that explains why Topuria was so willing to publicly name Makhachev as the reason the White House fight collapsed, and it traces back to the moment Makhachev vacated the lightweight belt before ever giving Topuria the fight he had given up a championship to pursue. Topuria had sacrificed a featherweight belt he won by knocking out Alexander Volkanovski and defended by stopping Max Holloway, moving to lightweight permanently because he wanted the biggest fight available, which was Makhachev at 155 pounds, only for Makhachev to leave the division before that fight could happen. Makhachev fired back on social media at the time, calling Topuria nobody in the lightweight division and just a big mouth from Spain with a nice haircut, which is the kind of language that does not stay in a press release cycle. It becomes the emotional substrate of an entire rivalry that follows both men into every subsequent negotiation. The stage could not have been set more perfectly for a historic super fight on the south lawn of the White House in front of the President of the United States on the 250th anniversary of the nation. And then came the phone calls.
Topuria's version of events arrived first through an interview with Spanish outlet Marca, and his account was visceral and specific in a way that suggested genuine surprise rather than calculated narrative management. He said he went to sleep knowing and thinking he was going to fight Islam Makhachev, that he woke up with a flood of phone calls telling him the opponent had changed to Justin Gaethje, and that nobody had prepared him for the overnight reversal of what he had been told was a finalized matchup. His implication was direct and unmistakable, that Makhachev had backed out of a fight that was effectively agreed upon, and the framing carried the weight of someone who had given up a featherweight championship specifically to chase this fight, and was now being told it had evaporated overnight without a satisfying explanation. What made the account compelling was not the emotion behind it, but the specificity. Going to sleep with confirmed information and waking up to chaos is not the description of exploratory talks. It is the description of a done deal that somebody walked away from between night and morning.
Makhachev's response arrived within hours on social media and directly contradicted Topuria's version in every meaningful detail, beginning with 4 words that set the tone for everything that followed. "I'm tired of hearing made-up stories." He said he received the call about the White House fight, accepted it immediately without hesitation, and then the next day was informed that Topuria's camp had demanded a purse so far beyond what the UFC was willing to pay that negotiations collapsed entirely before any contract was close to being signed. He went further back into the rivalry's financial history, referencing an earlier social media post where he had said Topuria's team would not need to ask for billions to fight him, and that phrase now carried new specific weight in light of the purse demand allegation he was publicly attaching to this specific negotiation. The detail about Topuria's manager confirming the money issue was the sharpest edge of Makhachev's account, because if true, it transforms the narrative completely from a champion who backed out into a champion who priced himself out of the biggest fight in MMA history. Dana White's version at the UFC 326 post-fight press conference did not split the difference between Topuria and Makhachev. It demolished both accounts simultaneously by denying the super fight was ever planned in the first place. He said flat out that it was never Islam versus Topuria, that the fight that fell apart that Friday night had nothing to do with either of them, and that a completely separate fight collapsed during a power slap event, triggering an overnight scramble at the UFC offices that ran until 9 in the morning and resulted in both Topuria and Gaethje being called for a completely improvised main event. White also separately confirmed that Makhachev was recovering from a hand injury, adding a physical layer to his denial that suggested the welterweight champion was not medically cleared to compete, regardless of what any negotiation had or had not produced. 3 versions, 0 consensus, and the only verifiable fact sitting underneath all of them is that Justin Gaethje received a confirmed phone call on Thursday telling him he was definitely not fighting on the White House card, followed by a call on Friday suggesting he might be, which means something real changed between those 2 days, and the question of what changed is precisely what nobody involved can agree on.
The weight of the observable evidence suggests that at a minimum, some level of serious discussion occurred between the UFC and both camps about a potential super fight, even if the exact stage that discussion reached before it collapsed remains genuinely contested. Makhachev's account that he personally received a call and personally accepted the fight directly contradicts White's claim that the matchup was never planned. And if the fight was never Islam versus Topuria, why was Makhachev receiving and answering phone calls about fighting Topuria at the White House in the first place? White's denial can be read through the lens of UFC promotional strategy because the organization has a long and documented history of downplaying negotiations that fall apart, particularly when admitting the collapse would damage the viability of the fight commercially in the future or create embarrassment for the promotion's matchmaking operation. If the UFC still wants Makhachev versus Topuria, and there is no question that this is the single biggest fight the organization could currently book, there is a powerful strategic incentive to deny it was ever on the table, rather than admit publicly that it fell through and let both sides relitigate blame through every media appearance until the next booking window opens. The fight that is actually happening on June 14th at UFC Freedom 250 is Topuria against Gaethje for the interim lightweight title, a unification bout between two genuinely dangerous fighters with everything on the line on the most symbolically loaded stage in American sports history. Gaethje earned the interim belt with a dominant performance over Paddy Pimblett at UFC 324, and this fight represents what may be his final legitimate shot at undisputed UFC gold, after a career defined by spectacular violence and a series of agonizing near misses at the championship he has been pursuing for years. Topuria is fighting to cement his status as a generational talent on a stage that will introduce his name to tens of millions of people who have never watched an MMA event, and a spectacular finish at the White House with global cameras broadcasting every second of it would give him a platform to demand the Makhachev fight with leverage no press conference or social media post could replicate. Looming over everything on June 14th is the shadow of the fight that Topuria says he went to sleep expecting, the fight that Makhachev says he accepted immediately, and the fight that Dana White says never existed. And one of those three men is not telling the truth.
The Makhachev versus Topuria rivalry has only grown more volatile in the wreckage of this White House collapse, and the public venom both champions have been directing at each other through screens and microphones since the card was announced has done something that usually takes months of careful promotional build-up to achieve. It has made the fight feel genuinely personal in a way that changes how an audience watches it, because a super fight between two technically elite champions who genuinely appear to dislike each other carries a psychological weight that no amount of media hype can manufacture if the underlying contempt is not real. The question is no longer whether Makhachev and Topuria fight, because both men are still champions, both are still in their prime, and the commercial logic of the matchup is so overwhelming that the UFC cannot afford to let the bitterness between their camps permanently block the biggest gate the organization could possibly create. The only question that remains is when they finally stop trading accusations across social media and stand across from each other inside an octagon, and whether either side will blink first before a contract gets signed, or whether the next phone call that lands in both their camps will be the one that actually holds.